You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leitch. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and also founder and editor of the EV-focused sister site, The Driven. And joining me, as usual, is ITK principal David Leitch. David, I trust you and what looks like a bear on top of your microphone are well.
I like to remember the future generations. I've got little things from my grandparents around here. It's quite a Chinese custom, I think, to decorate your computers, and one I picked up on, or so it seems. But I'm well, thanks very much, Giles. Trust the audience as well. Just back from a 2,300 kilometre round trip in the EV down to Horsham in Victoria. Pleased to report that the charging experience has improved quite a lot. Not so much with the Tesla superchargers, which don't seem to be open to other cars south of Sydney in the way that they are north, but the BP Pulse and the EV networks, just to mention two,
They're working. That's good. It wasn't so long ago that you went down to Victoria, I think it was for a bike riding thing, and you checked your car into a caravan park to charge it for 2 days.
It has improved, yes.
Well, that's good, yeah. I was actually at Everything Electric last weekend and spent 3 days there looking at a whole bunch of EVs and unfortunately a few hybrids and having discussions about vehicle to grid and talking to lots of people. Just really interesting just seeing the evolution and just the emergence of all these sort of Chinese brands.
I'll come back to that a little bit later, maybe after we get through our interview, Giles, because I think it's salient to a policy point, which is but let us at the moment get on to our interview. We've got an excellent guest this week, as usual. Jeff Lynn, a partner at Ashurst, who is talking about the proposed environmental legislation, which is a big topic, and he was able to... Well, anyway, let's hear what he had to say, shall we?
We shall.
Jeff Lynn, a partner at Ashurst, thanks very much for agreeing to be a guest on Energy Insiders.
Thanks very much, David. Long-time listener, and lovely to join you today for a discussion.
And we're talking the new National Environment Protection Laws. You're a partner in environmental law at Ashurst?
Yeah, that's right, David. I've spent my career, last 25 years or so, working as a planning and environmental lawyer based in the Melbourne office of Ashurst. So, yeah, lots of time spent advising clients on the environmental and planning approval process for major projects, and these days largely focused on the energy and resources sector.
And so we've got the new EPBC Act, and Ashurst put out a kind of summary of the facts. And the facts are one thing, and what's really going on is probably something slightly different. But maybe you could just run us through a brief of what the Act provides and what it ostensibly.
Okay, sure. Happy to do that, David. So for the last 25 years or so, at the national level, environmental law has been set out in a piece of legislation called the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. It's been amended a number of times over the last 25 years, but hasn't had any major surgery in that period. We've now got a situation where the government has brought forward a quite substantial reform package. That reform package is not a complete rewrite of the Act, but it certainly proposes to make a number of really significant changes to the way that it works. The legislative reform package is largely based on the key recommendations put forward about 5 years ago by Graham Samuel, who undertook a comprehensive review of the EPBC Act, and he concluded that it was failing both the environment and industry, and put forward a series of recommendations designed to improve the timeliness and efficiency of decision-making to address concerns of business, but also put in place some reforms that would improve environmental outcomes and so address concerns of the environmental movement. And so it's worth sort of thinking about the reforms through those two dual objectives of improving environmental outcomes as well as improving the efficiency and the timeliness and the quality of decision making for industry. So I think, in that context, just looking at a few of the major elements of the reform package. So the first point to note is that there'll be a new agency created, the National Environment Protection Agency, a new green regulator. The EPA will have a series of functions, particularly with respect to the administration and enforcement of the Act and the development of a number of, or discharging of a number of policy functions. The CEO of the EPA will carry a series of delegated functions, so be able to stand in the shoes of the minister and make a range of decisions, including undertaking assessments and granting approvals for some matters. However, the minister, him or herself, will retain decision-making responsibility in relation to major projects. Beyond the EPA, there's a number of other reforms, perhaps the most important of which is the creation of a series of national environmental standards, which will be framework documents that will guide the decision-making of the minister or of the EPA in relation to the way in which they assess projects and the way in which they undertake their evaluation of the acceptability of impacts of proposals.
Yes, and I think there's also a separate two parts to the new body, aren't there? One, the kind of decision making, and another one's the provision of data and bits and pieces like that, isn't there?
Yeah, one of the reforms that hasn't perhaps got as much airtime as some other aspects is the creation of a new agency called Environmental Information Australia, which will be essentially an environmental data collection agency. They'll take over responsibility for preparing things like the State of the Environment reports, but they'll also become a repository for environmental data that's collected by government through the course of undertaking assessments. And the expectation over time is that that's a body of data that will be available to inform decision making by the minister or by the EPA, but over time also as it is made available more broadly to the community to inform the project design by proponents. And you can imagine if you are the proponent of the third wind farm in a particular area, and the first two projects have undertaken detailed assessment and collected all sorts of very useful data, an ability to access information that's been relied upon by the government in making prior decisions may well be very useful for you as the proponent of that third wind farm, and would enable decisions about the risks associated with that project to be analysed more quickly. And so I think one of the benefits potentially of the creation of this new agency is that environmental information will be more readily available and more accessible, and therefore
That's part of this REZ-wide kind of process that I think Murray Watts, the current minister, sort of discussed ahead of the release of the draft of the legislation. Now, let's come to the two main problems of the previous legislation, which was, one, its lack of timeliness, I think would be the way I would just describe it. I mean, we have a lot of discussion about productivity in Australia and the lack of productivity growth. And I personally think that government, as well as asking everyone else what can be done, could have a look at self. And certainly,
Sure.
And on the other hand, we also have the other side saying that this doesn't write global warming or climate change into the legislation, and that. But I think you said that there'll be a series of briefs or headings that the new body will guide how it undertakes assessments. Why don't we just talk about because it interests me is the timeliness side of things and how the new legislation, if it's passed, might improve that.
Yeah, look, you're right. The timeliness is probably the thing that people are most concerned about with the current regime. The delay, I think, in approvals comes from a number of factors. It's not sort of one on its own. It's really the interaction between a series of them. The duplication between state assessment processes and federal assessment processes is a key issue. At the moment, major projects.
Sorry, yes, you were going to go on and say, but my understanding is that New South Wales and the federal government have a kind of sign off with a joint approach. I mean, or at least if it's, but the other states, they're completely separate. I mean, that's a very lay
Yeah,
understanding.
look, the Commonwealth government's entered into a series of bilateral agreements with the states to accredit the state assessment process for purposes of evaluating impacts under the Commonwealth Act. That's the case in New South Wales. It's the case in Victoria. It's generally the case around the country, although not all projects fall within it. What that means is that the state assessment process does the bulk of the assessing of the impacts of a project and generates an assessment report that's provided both to the state decision maker, but also to the Commonwealth decision maker. So ostensibly, promptly after receipt of that assessment report, the Commonwealth Minister, in theory, could make a decision under the EPBC Act as to whether to grant approval or not. What we often see, though, is that after the Commonwealth received that assessment report from the states, the Commonwealth Department then undertakes further and additional assessment and has more questions to ask proponents and wants more information. And that process can take 3, 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years from the date that a state assessment was completed. And in theory, at least, the Commonwealth was in a position to make its own assessment. And so the fact that the Commonwealth is effectively undertaking a second layer of assessment after the states have completed their task is one of the significant problems with the way that things currently work. There's a solution to that that's been proposed as part of this reform package, and that is for the Commonwealth to accredit the states, not just to undertake an assessment on their behalf, but also to undertake the making of the decision on their behalf as well. And so if the Commonwealth was to accredit the states for that second purpose, then that would cut out the step that I've said generates, in many cases,
And
significant
yet the
delay.
political reality is that the federal government's never going to cut itself out of the deal altogether, is it really?
Well, what they're proposing, would involve them being cut out of the deal, in a sense, David. Although what they'll be doing is rewriting the rules of the game, insofar as the state assessment process will have to meet certain benchmarks in order to be accredited by the Commonwealth. And so what the states will need to do is demonstrate to the Commonwealth that they've got an assessment framework that will ensure decisions that they make are not inconsistent with the newly proposed national environmental standards, won't result in any unacceptable impacts, and that's a new concept that's been defined in the reform package. And any residual significant impacts must meet the net gain test, and that's an obligation effectively to offset any significant impacts that a project will cause. And so, this second layer of accreditation. Accreditation for states to make decisions will only be granted to them if they uplift their systems and their decision-making processes to achieve those 3 limbs. And so I think
But
that's
they
a real
don't even
task.
know what they have to lift them to yet because the limbs haven't
No.
been defined, have they?
Well, not no, that's right. So there's still work to be done to establish those national environmental standards in particular. And yeah, states would need to ensure that their systems were adequate to address those.
That's right. And so that's the basis for which the timeliness would improve. It would essentially, by to keep it really simple, the Commonwealth delegating it back to the states more fully.
Yeah, look, that's one of the ways in which timeliness will improve. There are some others. So there's a streamlined assessment process that's been proposed that would provide for projects that undertake a comprehensive assessment as part of their initial project referral to the Commonwealth Minister to be assessed and approved on a more expedited timeframe. Um, there's also a proposal, and you mentioned a moment ago, Murray Watt's proposal around reses. So I think what you're referring to there is the proposal to create bioregional plans. Bioregional plans are the instruments that would create the so-called go and no-go zones. And within those bioregional plans, there would be designated priority actions. And if you were proposing to undertake a designated priority action, which, for example, might be build a solar farm in a res, then provided that you complied with some other elements of the plan, then you would be exempt from the need to obtain an EPBC approval. The approval of the bioregional plan itself would effectively grant that approval.
And I think Europe's had some legislation along those lines for a while, but let's not get sidetracked on what other jurisdictions are doing. but the delegation to the states, I always think that what it might be good for a wind farm might also be good for something that I personally don't really want, like a big new coal mine or a great gas field in West Australia. So we could still have, proposals for new gas fields delegated to, say, the West Australian government under this, provided they met the federal limbs.
Well, I mean, in theory, that's right, David. So I don't think there's any intention that the accreditation be limited to only certain technology types or only certain project types and not others. So that um, uh, that risk remains. Although, of course, in order to be approved, that project, was a fossil fuel project, for example, it would need to comply with the three limbs that I outlined a moment ago.
And so I'll come back to those limbs, but I guess this comes to the complaint by the greener side of things that, there should have been a climate change objective explicitly written into this draft legislation.
Yeah, look, that's certainly a major complaint that the Green Movement has made is that there's no so-called climate trigger. There's no requirement on the part of the minister to directly assess the climate change impacts from a project. Now, um, the government's been quite clear in saying that they're not proposing to introduce that. That's largely because they have developed a suite of other policy measures, the safeguard mechanism and a range of other things that they say are the policy vehicle for addressing emissions in Australia. And to introduce climate change into the EPBC Act would be to duplicate existing frameworks. And what they're seeking to do is to reduce duplication. And so there's a kind of an internal logic in what they say. Obviously, the consequence of it.
Well, it sounds good when you say there's an internal logic.
Well, there's a political logic, at least, David. Um, there's a the reality is that as things presently stand, there's no comprehensive assessment of the impact of greenhouse gas emissions under Commonwealth law. There's no.
Can I just pause there because and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a financial analyst. I'm forever having to talk about topics like electrical engineering and stuff that I really don't understand. And certainly the law falls in that category. But I do see that in case law, international law can influence, say, New South Wales court decisions where climate change is considered in some particular approvals of, say, coal mines and stuff. I guess, could you just explain to me how the law actually considers climate change formally, but the legislation doesn't?
Yeah, well, again, we operate in a federal system, David, and the Commonwealth assessment framework is, it requires assessment of the matters that the Act sets out need to be considered, and climate change is not included in the framework is required assessment under the EPBC Act. But at the state level, it very much is a feature of the assessment process, and so, coal mines in New South Wales or oil and gas projects in other parts of the country are required under those relevant frameworks to both disclose the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those projects, and decision makers, will have regard to the climate change impacts of those projects in deciding whether or not to approve them. And so, the call for a climate trigger to be introduced into the EPBC Act sometimes misses the point that there is a mechanism at state level for those emissions to be assessed and the acceptability of them or otherwise to be considered. Although, I mean, I think in fairness, at state level, state decision makers often point to the fact that there's a Commonwealth regime in place in the form of a safeguard mechanism to address climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And so there is, to some extent, a little bit of circularity in some of those arguments. But, I think it's not true to say that there's no mechanism under Australian environmental law for an assessment of the impacts of climate change.
No, that isn't true. But if and again, it seems to me that the way you're describing it, the federal legislation in regard to the environment law would be looser than some of the state regimes, because the state regimes do have to consider climate change, whereas the proposed federal law excuses itself from doing that because it claims because it can point to other mechanisms outside of environment law.
I mean, it's true that the Commonwealth law doesn't deal as comprehensively as some other laws with climate change, but I don't think it's true to say that the Commonwealth law is not as robust or doesn't deal with environmental issues as thoroughly as state regimes. It's just that the Commonwealth law picks the specific matters of national environmental significance that it will regulate, and it leaves other issues beyond that category of specifically regulated matters to be dealt with by the states.
Yes, it still doesn't seem to me, and I don't want to belabor this point. I'm sure there are more other things to get on to, but when I look at the National Electricity Law, it now includes a climate change trigger quite specifically. I would just observe, without talking any more about it, that it seems strange that the Environment Law is the only piece of legislation that won't be talking about climate change as a head. But as a lawyer, no doubt you understand that perfectly.
Well, I mean, I think you make a fair point, David. It's a very legitimate policy debate to be having as to whether, as a matter of good policy, climate change ought to play a more central role in the decision making, in our sort of national centerpiece, environmental law.
Run me through these three heads again. What's the first head?
So, not inconsistent with a national environmental standard.
What does that mean?
So what that means is that every time the minister or the EPA assess the acceptability of a project, undertake an assessment of the environmental impacts of a project with a view to determining whether those impacts are acceptable or not, they need to consider whether that project is consistent with consistent with national environmental standards. And so what those national environmental standards will do is prescribe a set of environmental objectives, environmental outcomes that it is policy to achieve.
Can you give me an example of the sort of thing that might be that there might be?
Yeah, sure. So with respect to threatened species, there will be an objective in terms that the project not have an unacceptable or unsustainable impact on that threatened species or on the critical habitat that supports that threatened species. And so there'll be a prescribed objective threshold of impact that a project should not exceed.
Exceed.
That's
right,
framed
let's leave that
in terms of that instrument that hasn't yet been drafted. I can't tell you, but that's that.
No. Okay, let's. I'll come back to it. I want to get onto offsets and biodiversity credits and nature positive if we get a chance. But the second heading.
So the project must also not have a so-called unacceptable impact. So unacceptable impact is a new defined term introduced into the Act, and it's quite a long definition. Each of the different matters that are protected under the Act will have its own definition of an unacceptable impact, but largely it will turn on an impact that will seriously impair or seriously damage the relevant environmental value. And so it will be, again, a threshold that cannot be exceeded by a project and its impacts.
And the third heading?
The third heading is that any residual significant impacts must meet the net gain test. What will happen is that a project and its impacts will be assessed if it passes the first two hurdles, but there are still some significant impacts associated with the proposal, then the net gain test is enlivened, and that is essentially a requirement to provide an offset, and there'll be an offset calculator set out in the regulations that will enable effectively a quantum of environmental benefit that needs to be delivered by the project to achieve a net gain to be determined. And that can either be then delivered by way of undertaking project works to deliver that environmental good, so undertaking a project that enhances some feature of the environment, or, and this is a new element of it, there's an ability to pay what will be called a restoration contribution charge, which is a fancy way of saying
a levy.
You pay some money, you pay a levy, you'll pay an amount of money which represents the the monetary value of the offset that you otherwise could have provided, you'll pay that money to the Commonwealth Government into a special fund that will be administered by a new office, and that money will be spent on achieving environmental benefits, carrying out restoration activities of various sorts.
It'll go into consolidated revenue, you're telling me. No, I'm just joking.
Well,
I'm
no,
just
it won't go into
joking.
consolidated revenue, David, but it will go into a bucket, and that bucket will be spent on restoration activities.
Now, let's just talk about. I want to talk about what you think about it in a while. But the fact is, it's draft legislation at the moment.
Yep.
It has to get passed. When you think about how it's going to, do you think it will actually be legislation?
Oh, look, it's a sort of unknowable question to speculate about, David, isn't it? I mean, there are two pathways for the government. The first is to reach agreement with the Greens, and the second is to reach agreement with the coalition. There's no other pathway through other than those two. The coalition at this stage, obviously, as we've seen this week, tying themselves in knots over another environmental issue, net zero. So don't really have their eye on the ball insofar as EPBC reform goes at the moment. So the preliminary commentary that we've heard from the coalition is that they don't support it, although I haven't heard any sort of meaningful extrapolation of their position. So I guess over time we'll hear more.
There are
from them.
various positions, according to what I read.
Yeah, they're various positions.
No,
So,
I should.
presumably they'll be called upon to articulate some more thoughtful position before too long. The Greens, on the other hand, have said they don't support it either, and they've pointed to the absence of a climate trigger. They've also pointed to the absence of any change to the native forestry settings, or effectively any means by which the current loss of native forests will be addressed. And that's, those are probably the two key issues, and there are some others, but those are probably the two, I guess, marquee issues from the Greens perspective. Now, I haven't heard a sort of a set of crystallized amendment proposals from the Greens that are sort of put in the form of, if you accept these proposed amendments, then we will support you to pass the bill. So, quite what the Greens position translates to in practical sort of parliamentary terms, I don't know, but certainly at the level of sort of public square rhetoric, they're opposed to the amendments, and fairly sort of strongly opposed is their current position.
That's right. And I hadn't heard about the native forest side of things. How seriously should I take their concerns there?
Oh, I think you should take them really seriously. So, I mean, I think, the environmental movement, and certainly the Greens Party, and some of the sort of the most prominent environmental groups around the country point to the biodiversity loss associated with the continuation in some states of Australia of native logging, native forestry, as being one of the sort of single greatest contributors to environmental decline, and they're calling for a cessation of native forestry operations sort of on an Australia-wide basis. That's been one of the key criticisms that they've made.
That comes down to hardwood logging, doesn't it, really? Like most of the softwood, the stuff that goes into timber frames, comes from pine plantations and things. You go into native forests to get your hardwood timbers,
that's
don't
right.
you?
Yeah. So, and there's still native forestry occurring in Tasmania and New South Wales. Principally, I think, are the two states that continue to be the focus of the Greens' focus on that issue.
We don't know, but would amendments in that regard, it seems to me, would be less public. I mean, it's less. How can I put it? Like not having a climate trigger, it's either a yes or a no. I mean, and then you would have to have a debate about what the climate trigger was in the legislation. I mean, whereas what we don't really know what the coalition actually wants. Their objection, I think, is to the having a separate agency altogether, or the delegation, or to having the minister have final say. I mean, what do they object to?
Yeah, well, those were all issues that were raised before the release of the bills, and when the package was still being put together, they were very firm on a desire that the minister retain, when I say they, I'm talking about the coalition here, that the minister retain the decision-making power with respect to projects. But, we've not heard, I've not heard a sort of um, a thorough analysis of the bill from the perspective of the coalition. So, I'm really unclear as to what amendments they would require.
I shouldn't be cynical, but they're still thinking about, no doubt, their small modular reactors or something. Look, it's not my job in this discussion to be political, but I would agree with you. I haven't heard what they object to. What about land clearing generally? Does that fit within the legislation?
Yeah, so native forestry is dealt with through a separate regional forestry agreement framework. So that sort of sits a little bit outside of the framework of the EPBC Act at the moment. But land clearing, for other purposes, is subject to regulation under the Act. And so, if there's a proposal to clear forest for a housing development or some other sort of project, then the proposal to clear that native forestry does, to the extent that it may have the potential impact on a matter that's protected by the EPBC Act, then it is subject to the Act, and referrals would typically need to be made to the Commonwealth Minister, and a decision about whether an assessment's required, and then ultimately an approval in accordance with the ordinary rules.
Just coming back to the delegation to states, provided thing, it would still be the case that the states that would assess the project in line with the Commonwealth guidelines and the project, and maybe give it a tick, but then the minister would still have a final say. Like a state might oppose a project, and a minister might give it the go ahead, or vice versa.
Well, obviously, for a project to go ahead, it needs approvals at the state and the Commonwealth level. One doesn't replace the other. Under the currently tabled proposals, if a state government was accredited to both undertake an assessment and make a decision under the EPBC Act, then the Commonwealth Minister would not need to make a decision. The state decision would stand for both the state and the Commonwealth, and so.
Sorry, just to be clear, when you say would not need to be involved, you mean could not be involved because the power's been delegated away.
Yeah, that's right.
So in the end, this idea that the minister's making the final decision doesn't apply if the accreditation system applies.
Yeah, look, that's right. So if the state is accredited to make the EPBC decision, and in order to obtain that accreditation, the state assessment process needs to meet that bar that's been set by the Commonwealth. If the state climbs up and achieves that bar and is accredited, then the state decision would obviate the need for a Commonwealth decision. That's right.
See, I'm glad I've had this discussion, because I could have read this legislation for a long time and I would never have understood that. And I don't think ChatGPT would have either. So it's interesting. It's quite not what it seems like on the surface, is it really? And I mean, is there an expectation that the states will reach that accreditation? I mean, is that the general intent of it?
Yeah, look, I think so. The Business Council of Australia have come out and said that they consider that the bills ought to proceed through Parliament together with the accreditation of at least one state at that revised level. I think there's a real concern that it will take considerable time and effort for states to develop the frameworks that will be capable of achieving that new level. It will require, I think, a degree of policy work by states, and therefore a commitment by the states to achieve that level of accreditation. It won't happen incidentally. And so it's therefore got to be a priority of the relevant state to pursue it. And they're going to have to work closely with the government, with the Commonwealth government, to be clear on what's required, and put in place those measures, and work with the Commonwealth government to update their bilateral agreement to achieve that outcome. So I don't think it's going to happen sort of overnight. And it's only going to happen if the state and the Commonwealth work together to achieve it. But the Commonwealth, having sort of pushed that mechanism in this reform package as, one of the sort of central planks of how it will achieve over time the streamlining of EPBC decision making, has now got a bit of skin in the game in terms of achieving that outcome. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. But I'd like to think that one or more states will put the effort in and achieve that outcome.
So, just looking at the order of events here and then the timetable, the order of events is that the legislation that the government works out drums up enough support to get the legislation through the Senate. It then becomes law. They then have to do the detailed drafting of the relevant standards, bits and pieces and then the states can go to work on becoming accredited. So that whole process would probably, from the date that the legislation is actually passed, you're still looking at what, 3 years or something like that?
Oh, look, I'm not going to sort of speculate about how long it would take for the states to achieve accreditation. I mean, it's a meaningful body of work. It would take um, you know months or a year or potentially more than that, David. I mean, I'd be sort of guessing. It will depend obviously on the the extent of commitment to the task and the level of
Yes,
resourcing that's put towards the task. Um, you
yes.
know, things can be done if that's if
If
the
there's a
wind is
war on.
blowing, if there's a war on, if the wind's blowing in that direction strongly enough, then things can happen pretty quickly. But we shouldn't um, discount the amount of work involved in doing it.
And in the meantime, for the first thing, all the current projects that are in the current process will continue to be assessed under the current process no matter what.
Look, that's right. So if you've got a project that's currently under assessment at the moment, then it will continue to be assessed under the current law. There's some reasonably complex transitional provisions, which I won't go into, right now, David, for at what point in the process projects need to get to before they fall in or out of
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
new the new the new framework. But certainly projects that are sort of, you know, in the EPB system at the moment, if I can describe it that way, will continue to be assessed under the current framework.
I'm a great one for having, published sort of guidelines, not guidelines, but benchmarks of, timelines, like we've had this many projects go into the queue and we've had this many approved in 12 months or 24 months. I mean, I look at the Winterbourne wind farm in New South Wales, which admittedly could be considered controversial because it's politically opposed. And it's been in the EPC process, as far as I can see, for at least 5 years now. I mean, I can't understand how any project could be in a process for 5 years. Do you know what I mean? It's like Kafka
Yeah.
wouldn't have written that long.
Yeah, look, I remember a discussion some years ago with a client of mine who said, Jeff, look, we'd much prefer a fast no to a slow yes. And I think never a truer word said. I mean, I think one of the time kills projects, and something really does need to be done to unblock the system to enable projects to move through it more quickly.
And so, Jeff, what is your expectation? Is it your expectation that the legislation, maybe with some amendments, will actually get through?
Oh, look, I'd really like to think so, David. I mean, I think, whilst no reform package is perfect and, there's plenty of good discussions to be had about ways that this package could be improved, I think, there's a number of really important elements of it that I think will improve the quality and the transparency of decision making. And I think that's good both for industry and that's good for the environment. So I think,
And the
I'd like to
government
see it
and the
go
and the
through.
government would lose a lot of face if it doesn't get through, wouldn't it really? It's made this a thing that it wants to do. It's released its draft legislation. I kind of feel like, it needs to get it through. It's,
Yeah,
it's
look, there's certainly it's certainly got some political capital
and I'm
invested in
and
this
Jeff,
process.
lawyers don't make bets, I know, but if you were betting, would you bet that the agreement would be with the coalition or with the Greens?
um, Look, yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer, David. I haven't seen anything from either of them that fills me with a great degree of hope, to be totally honest with you, David. I think that the coalition will come under significant pressure from industry to be part of of delivering an outcome.
But
You
they
know,
don't pay any attention. They don't represent industry anymore, right?
well, that's
I mean,
that's
that might. This
um,
is me, the son
mm,
of a politician talking. They represent, a completely different demographic. They don't represent industry at all, hardly.
yeah. Look, that's I think that's a fair observation. David. So
And on the other hand, the Greens probably would like to get some legislation passed. I mean, they got hammered for being, but again, I'm just speaking politically now. They got hammered at the last election for being opposing everything. And whilst there's no doubt some very legitimate points, I mean, it's often been the case that the perfect is really the enemy of the good, particularly in politics. I mean, it would, I could argue that it might suit their political fortunes to get a few wins and then give it a tick.
yeah, look, you'd like to think so. I mean, I think that, that risk, or that old adage of the perfect being the enemy of the good, is a grave risk of reoccurring, I fear. Um, whilst I think, there's always ways in which a reform package can be improved. I think it's implausible to argue that that this reform package doesn't generate environmental benefit. I don't think you can credibly say that the law the day after the enactment of these bills is in worse shape than the day before. And so I'd like to see, on that basis alone, the Greens sort of play a constructive role and prosecute arguments they might have for amendments where they think they're justified, and run those arguments through the the policy formation process. But ultimately, I'd like to think that they'd support the bills.
I would too. I'd like to see the Greens be a bit more constructive myself. But anyway, they will be what they will be. I also want to ask again, I think it was Ken Henry, and you excuse me, I cover so many topics, I get confused, about reviewed the biodiversity process and decided it wasn't working very well like everything else. And I think we had Nature Positive come along. Do you think the third limb I mean, I'm sort of somewhat dubious about having the federal government taking on the role of national biodiversity defender and spender. I kind of feel most of the money will get chewed up within the federal bureaucracy, or I worry about that. And is that really the best way to do it, rather than delegating it down to individual projects and REZs? I was just looking at something today that Andrew Bray, a video published about how the Dudonnell wind farm had got restored some wetlands in Victoria and got the brolgas going again. And isn't it best to think global, act local? Don't delegate it to the federal government.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the advantages that this proposal offers is the benefits of aggregating funds into a particular vehicle that can then dispense them at scale to address landscape-wide issues. And so I think that's a great advantage that perhaps focusing on the addressing of impacts on a sort of project by project basis doesn't necessarily offer. One of the other issues is that the way that offsets have been treated as requiring effectively a sort of a like for like, within a local environmental context, to be achieved is in practice quite difficult in many cases. And so you end up sort of scratching around looking for projects that and that are either expensive having regard to that local context, or are delivered in a way where ultimately there might have been a greater environmental benefit achieved if you're able to sort of look more broadly at ways of generating restoration outcomes. So I think there's certainly some opportunity through the more flexible tool that's been proposed here to generate restoration at landscape scale, which is ultimately the issue that needs to be addressed.
Well, it is. And yet, on the other hand, one of the main issues in the whole transition is the local community and their feeling that their needs need to be, the relationship between the two. And so that, at least at the REZ level, you would like to think that the any environmental concerns go back into that particular REZ and produce tangible benefits for the people that are directly affected. But that, as I said, is an ongoing debate and stuff like that. Jeff, I've asked a lot of questions. I may have missed the point on a number of issues. Is there anything else that you wanted to tell our audience? Because we listen hard.
Look, David, I think there's been a pretty sort of broad-ranging discussion. So I think we've covered most of the points that perhaps I thought we should. One issue, particularly for the listeners of this podcast, that is, I think something that attention should be given to is the possibilities that the bioregional planning process offers to align with the state-based REZ process. And so, we've got in Victoria, the Victorian Transmission Plan, the creation of REZs, recently announced. We've obviously got a process in New South Wales that's a little bit further ahead. And those are zones that are being designated on sort of on a bioregional basis as being appropriate for the build out of more significant renewable resources over the future. The bioregional planning process that the government's proposed provides an opportunity for areas within a bioregion, which might overlap very neatly with a state res boundary, to be designated as effectively go zones for particular types of development. But provided that within that bioregion there are other areas that are designated as conservation areas, and there are other priority restoration projects that are designated as well. And so the bioregional planning process sort of designates on the one hand go zones, and on the other hand no go zones that are to be preserved and restored. And I think it does provide a mechanism for achieving a level of balance in the way that development takes place within particular designated regions that I think could provide a really powerful model, particularly if communities can be engaged to participate in the development of that bioregional plan, so that the right attributes in the local environment are preserved, and that the right values are enhanced through the restoration activities that will go together with the plan.
I agree with all of that. My only thought as a humble analyst is that would have been great 5 years ago. Most of the REZs will be built by the time the standards are written. That would be my comment, or at least I hope they will be. We've got a 2030 target, and would you give odds of 50% that a 50-50 that this legislation will be passed within 6 months? Yes or no?
Yes. There you go.
Good. I like that. We've got to be an optimist, haven't we, in this business?
Indeed.
You have to be an
David.
optimist. You have to be an optimist. Otherwise, you can't be in it at all. Jeff, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing this. I do so like talking to people who know what they're talking about. It makes a change, because it's normally just me and Giles, and we don't. So thanks very much indeed.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, David. It's been a great discussion.
And that was Jeff Lynn from Ashurst. I couldn't be part of that discussion because of some unforeseen events at my end. But look, really interesting stuff, actually. That was probably the clearest breakdown and summary of the main points of the EPBC Act that I've heard. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in Parliament. I think, as you sort of alluded to, the Liberals, having a look at their sort of energy and climate policy that they've unveiled over the last week, are just not serious players at all, as much as business would like them to be. It may have to go to the other side, and the Greens, who have their own sort of principles to stand on. But look, we saw back in 2012 with the Gillard government and the ability to deal with independents and Greens, you can come up to a good solution.
Well, the Greens need to remember that the perfect's not the enemy of the good, and that in my opinion, the perfect is the enemy of the good, and they've before demonstrated that. Sometimes I really wonder if I understand federal politics at all, or even politics in general, where people are prepared to die in a ditch for things that aren't really worth it. I mean, if you want no change to the legislation, that's fine. You can achieve that. But in my opinion, the Greens have already shown at the ballot box how they get punished for just being the party of no.
Yeah, but they have shown their ability to come to an agreement. I think with the Clean Power Act that was done with the Gillard and Bob Brown, that takes both sides coming to the negotiating table. So not just the Greens and Labor.
Yes, and I do agree with that, Charles. And I think there's room to negotiate on the bill, but you have to go into negotiations with a willingness that, if you can, you want it to.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I don't want to harp on it too long, because hopefully these guys aren't going to be in government for at least another two election cycles. But I mean, gosh, their energy and climate policy, I We did talk about it last week, I think, briefly, and then we got the confirmation of the details over the weekend, such as they are, which is basically talking about saying no to everything. That's basically their policy, is to no to anything that's been invented in the last sort of 50 years.
It's just completely dumb. And it really isn't worth talking about. It's not a policy that is going to appeal to anyone that really counts, but neither is there. But those people, the people that they represent, deserve some representation, and there's no doubt a class of believers in what the Liberals stand for, as well as a bunch of vested interests. But we've all got vested interests, so good luck to them. They're welcome to their views. I think it makes it. I'm far more interested in understanding truthfully now that we're not hosting COP, whatever number it is. What number is it?
It will be 31. Yes, it's going to Turkey.
It's going to Turkey. That's okay. It would be nice to have a great big trade fair. I think it would have demonstrated a lot of things. But the absolute truth of the matter is there's plenty for Chris Bowen and federal Labor to get stuck into here. Right now, it looks to me like the CIS is failing. The only measure for CIS success, right, the reason why it was introduced is to get projects up to getting started. And, we've had 12 gigawatts of projects get a CIS award, and so far 500 megawatts of them have started. Some of the projects are clearly not going to start for years and years and years. They're missing transmission approval, they're missing environmental approvals. Hardly any of them have got a PPA. One or two have. And it's not good enough. The CIS was introduced to make sure that the federal target, not a policy per se, but the target of roughly 80% renewables by 2030 was actually going to get achieved. And at the moment, unless a whole bunch of wind farms, particularly in New South Wales, get started in 2026, we're not going to get to that target.
Well, that was the point made by Vestas' Daniel Kremer when he came on a couple of weeks ago, and it was a well-made point. The Ungala wind farm being built by Andrew Forrest in the west of New South Wales is the only. I was struck to read in our own publication that it was the only wind farm under construction at the moment in Australia, just done some concrete pours. David, it's failing. What do you do? How do you tweak it? What do you do?
Well, the first thing to understand is that, in my opinion, is that we don't really know why it's failing because there's not enough disclosure.
No, that's right.
So you don't get any information about price. Now, I'm going to write something about this because what it means is that every subsequent auction is still wandering around in a fog of not knowing what the prices are. So we can't converge on the appropriate prices. The second part of it probably is that there is a problem. The market isn't clearing for wind. That's why we need the CIS. And why isn't it clearing? Because the cost of wind has gone up, and the buyers don't have to buy, and they've got sticker shock at the prices that they have to pay. So if we look at the policies that have been successful in Australia, they are mostly those ones that create new demand as opposed to kind of a forcing supply. So, like household batteries, even the REC policy put the onus on retailers to actually get a share. So it was a demand pool policy. The feed-in tariffs kind of are a demand pool policy, as are small solar credits. Even the vehicle leasing, novated leases, which is the only part of the EV policy that's really taken off. And then only to a sector of market that do you have a novated lease? No, and most of us don't because we're not in the financial circumstances, the jobs where it would be advantageous. But that's you're not sufficiently well organised in that case, Giles. But the point here is the vast majority of the population can't really access a novated lease. So that's not a particularly good, a sufficiently good policy either. It's a good policy, but not sufficiently good.
Yeah. And I quite like the CIS in principle, but as you say, it's the lack of transparency. I just remember the ACT government one, which was similar. It had a CFD, a contract for difference, rather than this sort of range. But you knew the prices, and that's what generated interest and competition. And I'd just like to relate one particular anecdote from one energy company I was talking to, and it's probably not too hard to guess who they were. They had two projects put into it, one which is ready to build, another one which is not ready to build. And the one that's not ready to build got the Guernsey and the CIS. I said, well, that's because you bid low, isn't it? And they said, well, yes.
So that's dumb. That's dumb.
Yes.
I mean, the CIS really, it's poor execution. Like in the share market, one of the very first things I learnt when I went in there, someone told me, is that the market rewards discipline and execution. So whether the CIS is a good plan or a bad plan, I just don't think it's been executed very well at the moment. Anyway.
Yeah, well, we need transparency, and I think that's probably the main thing that needs to be done. I'm not too sure what else can be tweaked. Although it's interesting, I mean, they're making some tweaks. They've shortened the tender period. They've gone through one phase rather than two phases. Brings it into 6 months rather than 9 months. They've expanded it. This week they've just rolled out their latest storage tender. And that's got some tweaks to it, so they can have smaller batteries, which are aggregated. And then they've also got batteries can be doing different services rather than just sort of time shifting. The output of wind and solar. They could be acting as shock absorbers. They could be providing system services such as system strength. So that's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out. But
So, Charles, if I'm feeling a bit grumpy about it, I would describe it, they're going to hand out more participation certificates. As opposed to stuff that's actually the only real true test of the success of the CIS is, do the projects get built?
Well, that's true. And look, at least we know on battery storage that they are getting built. I mean, I think your 12 gigawatt figure was probably just for wind and solar, and 500 megawatts just, batteries, no problem at all. So that's a partial success. But you're right, we need more of those wind and solar projects. I'd imagine we're going to get a lot of those solar battery projects over the line. And I think they will be built in time. But as you keep on reminding us, quite justifiably, we need a lot of wind.
We do. And New South Wales needs the wind. Half of those wind projects, 6 gigawatts of wind have been awarded, half of which is in New South Wales. The transmission's going to be there in New South Wales. HumeLink's going ahead, the Arana Link's going ahead, the New South Wales side of Energy Connect's going ahead. It's not the transmission that's the problem at the moment. It's the getting to FID on and getting those wind projects built. And as we also heard from Vestas, it's really poor execution by Australia that we're going stop, start. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to build smoothly, move the teams from one project to the next project. We all know how to do stuff well, and we're not doing it well.
Yeah. Well, that stop-start comes from sort of political decisions which are made to sort of rip up pieces of paper and to destroy things. Look, it's a shame that the COP's not coming to Adelaide because it'd be a fascinating place for them to look at the success of renewable energy growth. I mean, to think that it's actually gone from 1% renewables to 75% renewables in 16 years. I think last weekend it hit a peak of 157% renewables. Would have been greater if the whole of Project Energy Connect had been completed by now. There was an interesting event with minimum system load. I think there was warnings issued by the Australian Energy Market Operator almost every day last week or in the past week. Eventually, on 3 occasions, they had to put the Torrens Island battery on standby, basically telling it to sort of discharge in the morning, stand there on empty and wait for an instruction to come to sort of create demand to keep the grid stable. Now, in the end, that final instruction wasn't issued. And this sounds like a bad, complicated thing, but I just think it's kind of, it's a bit like when you start to talk about high prices, they can actually be a good thing because they can encourage people to invest in certain technologies. And this is what we're doing here. We're kind of in this sort of transition period where we're managing these sort of big swings. And the minimum system load is quite fascinating, but I think a lot of these batteries and electrification and other demand shifts will kind of address that. But anyway, I think it's really interesting and I get very excited about it. And so do our readers, because our minimum load story was by far our most read story this week. So there you go.
Yes, that's great. I think I was reading that globally there's about 300 gigawatt hours of batteries likely to be installed this year, which is certainly a big number.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And there's no doubt batteries are the hot thing, but just to point out that batteries by themselves don't create any electricity decarbonisation. They can replace oil in cars and things like that. And process heat electrification can use, but by itself, they don't do anything.
Well, they do actually, David, because if you put batteries into a grid, then they'll be able to absorb more sort of excess wind and solar at the right time.
But you've got to have the wind and solar.
Too true. And Tag Energy, I should mention, which is halfway through the biggest wind farm in the country, Golden Plains, has just announced it's going ahead with a big battery next to that facility. Not behind the meter. It'll be separately connected, so it won't necessarily be taking the wind directly from those turbines. But that's interesting. And once again, they're going market, no CIS, no nothing else. They've obviously got a few sort of customers in mind, which is what they did with Golden Plains. That's kind of the attitude we need to actually get things built and done.
Well, Giles, I would turn this idea that no one builds wind and solar because they don't know when the coal plants are going to close on its head. The absolute fact is the coal plants can't close until the wind and solar is built. And I would say that just building the wind and the solar will provide the certainty that the market needs. And that's the trouble. We're not getting the commitment enough at the moment, the financial commitment. And we discussed what super funds are or aren't doing. I was shocked to read that the largest super fund in the country was dealing with the fallout from a wind and solar developer in the United States that had gone broke. And yet it's doing, SFA. I won't translate those initials into the industry in Australia. And why? Basically because the developer in the United States is a listed developer, whereas over here in Australia you can't put any money into anything because it's not listed, and we've got all these issues that we discussed last week around superannuation. And because one of the technical side of things I learned after the interview, talking to my friend Jeff Warren, who's an expert in this topic, is that anyone can take their money out of super at any time. So if it's all in unlisted investments, that's a kind of a bit of an issue. So that's why you have to have a lot of the super money in the listed sector. But that doesn't help us decarbonise the country. Anyway, that's just talking about, I think what I'm saying here, there's an absolute ton of stuff for Chris Bowen to get his teeth into besides COP. That's what I'm saying.
Well, that's it. Well, he might have more time now, although he is going to remain as president of negotiations, whatever that ultimately means at the Turkey COP. But it'll be interesting to see how much of that time is that takes up over the next 12 months. It means he won't be here next November, I don't think.
And if we don't get the new supply built, Giles, we won't get the prices down. And if we don't get the prices down, we're still going to run into political issues at the end. The political issues don't matter so much at the moment when the ALP has a big majority. But in the end, you have to take advantage of the opportunities that you have to and build things on a good long-term basis. That's why disclosure is your friend when things go wrong. It doesn't matter much when things are going well. And when we were talking about EVs, I think we should have much stronger policies on EVs now. We're doing it with household batteries because there's a glut of batteries and they're cheap. But you can buy EVs pretty cheaply at the moment. I heard someone talking about, a leading brand where the price had been cut from like $140,000 to a much lower number. So I heard very recently about that. And I think there's a good opportunity to take advantage of the flood of EVs that are available globally at the moment with a stronger policy, which would only see us catching up to where people in Europe and China are anyway.
Yeah, look, we're still down below 10%, and most of Europe now above 20%, and Scandinavia at 60, 70, and Norway's at 98%. Even more interesting than the sort of the big price cuts. I mean, there's been a few of them from a few companies, just really slashing the top ones, I think. Hyundai slashed prices off their range by $30,000 and $40,000. But we actually saw in the last week BYD coming out with the Atto 1, which was low 20s, I think. That's actually really interesting.
So policies to encourage that would be great. But my question increasingly, I think what we learned from the COP failure, my reading of the news, the summary of what others are saying, is that basically it wasn't backed enough by people other than Bowen. It's not backed enough by Albanese and presumably Chalmers. And My question, therefore, becomes, is that a signal for how serious they are about the whole decarbonisation program, or do they just want to talk? Anyway, we've done a lot of talking, Giles, and it's getting on for tea time, isn't it?
It is tea time, but before we end it, I'll just say, yes, I think you're absolutely right about what's happening within the Labour Party. I think there's a difference between people like Bowen who are, who really believe in it, and the Labour machine, if you like to call it that probably believes in it less and would probably be thankful not to have the hassle, which is a sad reflection on the state of politics.
But I don't care so much about COP itself. I care about what it says more broadly.
And I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. I'm actually happy not to have to go to Adelaide for a COP conference. I went to 8 of the damn things up until Paris and swore I'd never go to another one, and now I don't have to. So there you go.
And we want to say thanks to
Jeff Lynn from Ashurst for appearing. And sorry I wasn't able to join the conversation, but you did very well, David. And Jeff was really interesting and quite clear. And I think we all learned a lot from that conversation. Thanks, of course, to our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. Do check out our other podcasts. Anne Delaney's been doing a series of great interviews. A lot of them sort of spun off from the Senate Committee on Misinformation and Disinformation. So that's really interesting. We've got an interesting interview on Solar Insiders as well, solar recycling issues. And on the Driven podcast, we held a live session on vehicle to grid featuring Origin Energy, AGL and Amber. And that was actually quite interesting.
Giles, it does seem that the Senate is a good place to have a discussion about misinformation and distortion, isn't it, really? You could have it in the lower house too, to be quite honest.
Well, they're investigating misinformation and disinformation, and look, there's been a few allegations made about me, which are quite funny because they're sort of so patently false. So I'm going to write about them when I can. But it's interesting. I mean, you've got Matt Canavan and what's his name from the Pauline's One Nation.
Malcolm Roberts.
You know, he's sitting on that committee. So I just
spaceman. You know.
I said if you want to have a look at misinformation, just have a look at the Liberal. The coalition policy. It's just extraordinary. Anyway, that was a naughty end. That was a fun end actually to our podcast. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be back with another episode of Energy Insiders. Look, possibly not next week because we've got a really good interview coming up, but we're not doing it until Friday afternoon, so we might have to wait until Monday unless something else comes up in the meantime. But we will be back on this program, on this airwaves, wherever it is you find us. Bye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.